Get your hands where I can see them! Sergeant Davis yanked Rebecca Thompson's wrists behind her back, so hard her canvas bag hit the marble steps with a dull thud. The handcuffs clicked twice before she could even process what was happening. Around them, 50 distinguished guests in dress blues froze mid-conversation, their morning coffee growing cold as they stared at the spectacle unfolding at Arlington's ceremonial entrance. Trespassing on federal property during a military funeral, Captain Martinez announced, his voice carrying across the crowd like he wanted everyone to hear. "Ma'am, you're under arrest." Rebecca didn't resist. She didn't scream or protest or demand explanations. She simply stood there in her second-hand black dress, letting them treat her like a common criminal, while colonels and generals watched from behind the security rope. Her silence seemed to frustrate them more than any argument could have. "Look at her," someone whispered from the crowd, probably another wannabe trying to crash the ceremony for attention. Major Williams stepped forward, examining Rebecca like she was evidence in a case he had already solved. No family badge, no invitation, no military connection whatsoever. He turned to the crowd with a satisfied smirk. Just another civilian who thinks grief gives her special privileges. But Rebecca's eyes weren't focused on the handcuffs or the humiliation or the whispered judgments. They were scanning the tree line beyond the ceremony site with the methodical precision of someone calculating fields of fire and extraction routes. In 28 minutes, those same officers would understand why that mattered. But first, they had to learn who they were really dealing with. The morning had started like any other for Rebecca Thompson. 4:30 a.m. alarm, black coffee in a chipped mug, bus ride from her tiny apartment above the hardware store to the Pentagon, where she spent 10 hours a day cleaning offices that held secrets she wasn't supposed to understand. Most days, she was invisible, a 40-something woman in a maintenance uniform, pushing a cart through corridors of power, collecting trash from desks where decisions about wars were made. That's exactly how she preferred it. But today was different. Today, Colonel Marcus Rodriguez was being laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, and Rebecca had something she needed to do. Something that couldn't wait. Something that had been eating at her for 3 weeks since she'd heard the news on a radio in the Pentagon break room. She'd taken the day off work, put on her only black dress, caught the 7:15 a.m. bus to Arlington, walked through the gates like she belonged there, even though she knew she didn't, not according to the guest list, not according to protocol, not according to anyone who mattered, but she belonged there for reasons none of them could possibly understand. The thick morning mist clung to Arlington like a shroud, wrapping around the endless rows of white marble headstones that stretched toward the horizon. Each marker stood at perfect attention, a silent army of the fallen that had been growing for more than 150 years. The air was heavy with moisture and the weight of accumulated grief, the kind that seeps into stone and never fully leaves. Rebecca walked steadily through the fog, her worn sneakers silent on the wet pavement. She'd been to Arlington before, but never for something like this, never for someone like Marcus Rodriguez. Her hands were steady at her sides, but anyone watching closely might have noticed how her eyes moved in a systematic pattern, automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the unconscious precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. But no one was watching closely. To the early morning joggers and groundskeepers, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be. Another mourner arriving early for a military funeral. Simple, ordinary, forgettable. They had no idea they were looking at a ghost. The ceremonial entrance to Section 60 emerged from the mist like something from a dream. Honor guards stood at attention in their perfect dress blues, their brass gleaming despite the lack of sunlight. A small checkpoint had been established just inside the gates, where 2 military police officers were checking invitations and identification with the methodical thoroughness of men who took protocol seriously. Sergeant First Class Davis noticed her first. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from wearing the uniform and knowing exactly where he fit in the world. His partner, Specialist Wade, was even younger, all sharp angles and nervous energy, like a guard dog waiting for permission to bark. Rebecca approached the checkpoint with the same steady pace she'd maintained since leaving the bus stop. No hurry, no hesitation. Just a woman with somewhere to be and the quiet determination to get there. Davis raised his hand in the universal gesture of authority. "Ma'am, I need to see your invitation and identification." Rebecca stopped 3 feet from the checkpoint, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "I don't have an invitation," she said, her voice soft but clear. But I need to be here. Wade's eyebrows shot up like she'd just confessed to a crime. You don't have an invitation? Then how exactly did you plan on attending a restricted military ceremony? I knew Colonel Rodriguez, Rebecca replied simply. He would want me here. Davis and Wade exchanged a look that said everything about what they thought of her claim. Davis pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what was obviously a guest list. What's your name, ma'am? Rebecca Thompson. Davis's finger moved down the screen with exaggerated precision. Nope, no Rebecca Thompson on the authorized list. He looked up with the satisfaction of a man who had just solved a puzzle. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we figure out what to do with you. But Rebecca didn't step aside. She stood there in her second-hand dress, her worn shoes, her faded canvas bag, and somehow managed to project a presence that made both MPs unconsciously straighten their postures. That's when Captain Martinez arrived. Martinez was everything Davis and Wade aspired to be. Confident, experienced, unflappable. He'd probably handled 1,000 situations exactly like this one. Uninvited civilians trying to crash high-profile military events. People who thought that their personal connection to the deceased gave them special privileges. He walked over to the checkpoint with the easy authority of someone who knew his presence alone would resolve whatever minor inconvenience was developing. What's the problem here, Sergeant? Ma'am doesn't have an invitation, Davis reported. Claims she knew Colonel Rodriguez personally, but she's not on any list. Martinez looked Rebecca up and down with the clinical assessment of a man trained to evaluate threats. He saw a middle-aged woman in discount clothing with calloused hands and tired eyes. No visible weapons, no aggressive posture, no signs of mental instability or substance abuse. Just another civilian who had somehow convinced herself she belonged at a ceremony reserved for military personnel, government officials, and family members. Ma'am, Martinez said, his tone professional but firm, I understand you're grieving. Loss makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider, but this is a closed ceremony for immediate family and military personnel only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Colonel Rodriguez saved my life, she said. I saved his. That makes us family in the only way that matters. The simplicity of her statement somehow made it more unsettling than if she'd shouted or pleaded or threatened. Martinez felt the first stirring of something that might have been curiosity, but he pushed it down. He'd heard every sob story in the book, every desperate attempt to gain access to restricted areas, every claim of special relationship or hidden connection. Ma'am, he said, if you have documentation proving your relationship to Colonel Rodriguez, I'd be happy to review it. Otherwise, I need you to leave. Now. Rebecca reached for her canvas bag with slow, deliberate movements that somehow managed to put all three MPs on edge without being overtly threatening. She opened the zipper and pulled out a small manila envelope, worn soft from handling. This is all I have, she said, offering the envelope to Martinez. He took it with the professional detachment of someone processing evidence. Inside was a single photograph, clearly old, showing a much younger Rebecca Thompson standing next to a man in combat fatigues. The man was unmistakably Marcus Rodriguez, though his hair was darker and his face carried fewer lines. Both of them were smiling, but it wasn't the forced smile of a publicity photo. It was the genuine expression of people who'd shared something significant. Martinez studied the photograph for a long moment. Where was this taken? He asked. Afghanistan, Rebecca replied. 2018. Can you be more specific? Kandahar Province. Forward Operating Base Chapman. Martinez's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. FOB Chapman had been decommissioned 5 years ago. Most of the operations conducted there were still classified. The fact that this woman knew the name meant something, though he wasn't sure what. And what was your role at FOB Chapman, ma'am? I was a contractor, Rebecca said. Medical support. The answer was technically true, which was the best kind of lie. Martinez handed the photograph back to her, but his assessment had shifted slightly. This wasn't some random civilian trying to crash a funeral. This was someone who had actually been in theater, who'd actually known Rodriguez in a combat environment. But that didn't change the fundamental problem. Ma'am, even if this photograph is legitimate, it doesn't constitute an invitation to a restricted military ceremony. I sympathize with your loss, but I can't make exceptions to security protocols. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Rebecca took the photograph back and carefully placed it in her bag. She looked at Martinez for a long moment. and he found himself noticing details he'd missed before. The way she stood with perfect balance, weight evenly distributed, the way her eyes automatically tracked movement in her peripheral vision, the way her breathing remained steady and controlled despite the stress of the confrontation. These were small things, subtle things, the kind of details most people would never notice. But Martinez had spent 15 years in the military, and he'd learned to read body language the way other people read books. This woman moved like someone with training, real training, the kind that didn't come from weekend self-defense classes or civilian contractor orientations. But before he could pursue that thought, the situation escalated. If this injustice is making your blood boil right now, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. These stories of hidden heroes deserve to be heard, and your support helps us honor their sacrifice. By now, a small crowd had gathered behind Rebecca. Word had spread through the early arrivals that there was some kind of incident at the checkpoint, and people were naturally curious. Most were keeping their distance, but a few had moved closer to get a better view of whatever drama was unfolding. Among them was Dr. Patricia O'Connor, the base psychiatrist who had been invited because of her work with Rodriguez's Special Operations Unit. She watched the confrontation with professional interest, noting the unusual dynamic between the woman and the military personnel confronting her. Also in the crowd was Major Williams, a Special Forces instructor who had served under Rodriguez during 2 deployments. Williams had the kind of presence that made people automatically step aside when he walked through a room. Broad shoulders, iron gray hair, and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by anything short of genuine courage. And then there was Second Lieutenant Brooks, fresh out of officer candidate school and eager to prove himself worthy of the uniform. He'd positioned himself where he could intervene if the situation required it, though he hoped it wouldn't. Confronting civilians wasn't what he had joined the army to do. Martinez was about to order Rebecca to leave the premises when the situation took an unexpected turn. An elderly man in the crowd suddenly clutched his chest and stumbled backward. His face went gray, his breathing became labored, and he dropped to one knee with a gasp that carried across the morning air. "Heart attack!" someone shouted. Dr. O'Connor immediately pushed through the crowd, her medical training overriding any concern about protocol. Several people pulled out cell phones to call 911, while others stepped back to give the victim space to breathe. But Rebecca moved before any of them. She was beside the fallen man in 3 steps, her hands already assessing his condition with practiced efficiency. Her fingers found his pulse while her eyes checked his color and breathing pattern. She loosened his collar and positioned him to improve blood flow, all while speaking in a calm, clear voice. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is Rebecca. I'm going to help you. Try to stay calm and breathe slowly." Dr. O'Connor reached them a few seconds later and immediately noticed that Rebecca had already performed the correct initial assessment and positioning. She was impressed, but not surprised. Many people had basic first aid training. What she didn't expect was what happened next. The man's condition deteriorated rapidly. His pulse became weak and thready, his breathing shallow and irregular. Dr. O'Connor recognized the signs of cardiogenic shock and knew they needed immediate intervention. "We need to get him to a hospital now," she said, pulling out her phone to call for an ambulance. But Rebecca was already moving. She'd opened her canvas bag and pulled out what looked like a small emergency medical kit. Nothing fancy or obvious, just a compact case that most people would assume contained aspirin and Band-Aids. Except it didn't. Rebecca opened the case to reveal a collection of medical supplies that no civilian contractor should have possessed. Preloaded syringes, cardiac medications, a portable defibrillator no bigger than a smartphone, equipment that was restricted to military medical personnel and required specialized training to use safely. Dr. O'Connor stared at the kit in shock. "Where did you get that?" But Rebecca was already drawing medication into a syringe with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. She found a vein in the man's arm without difficulty and administered the injection with perfect technique. The effect was almost immediate. The man's color improved, his breathing stabilized, and his pulse strengthened. Within minutes, he was sitting up and talking coherently. Dr. O'Connor looked at Rebecca with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. That was expertly done. "Where did you learn advanced cardiac life support?" Rebecca was repacking her medical kit with the same methodical precision she'd used to deploy it. "Military training," she said simply. "What kind of military training teaches you to carry restricted medications?" Rebecca's hands paused for just a moment, the kind that keeps people alive when there's no hospital for 100 miles. She stood up and shouldered her bag, leaving Dr. O'Connor with more questions than answers. The crowd was dispersing now that the emergency was over, and the ambulance crew was arriving to transport the elderly man to the hospital for observation. But the MPs hadn't moved. They'd watched the entire incident with growing amazement, and now they were looking at Rebecca Thompson with something approaching respect. "Ma'am," Sergeant Davis said, his tone noticeably different than it had been 10 minutes earlier. "That was incredible. You probably saved that man's life." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. She seemed more interested in getting back to her original purpose than in discussing her medical intervention. Martinez, however, was far from finished with his questions. "Ms. Thompson," he said, stepping closer to her, "I need you to explain how a civilian contractor happens to be carrying military-grade medical equipment and demonstrating advanced life support techniques that require specialized certification." Rebecca met his gaze calmly. "Like I said, military training." "That's not an answer," Martinez replied. "I've been in the military for 15 years, and I've never seen a contractor with that level of medical capability. Who exactly did you work for in Afghanistan?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Rebecca hesitated. Not because she was afraid, but because she was calculating how much truth she could afford to reveal. "I worked for whoever needed medical support," she said finally. "Sometimes that was regular army, sometimes it was special operations, sometimes it was people who don't officially exist." The last part of her answer sent a chill through Martinez that he couldn't quite explain. People who don't officially exist was military slang for the kind of classified operations that never appeared in official records. The kind of missions that were so sensitive, even their existence was a state secret. But before Martinez could follow up on that statement, Major Williams stepped out of the crowd. Williams had been watching the medical emergency with professional interest, but now he was studying Rebecca with the intensity of someone who'd recognized something significant. He approached the group with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Rebecca directly. "Did you just say you worked with people who don't officially exist?" Rebecca looked at Williams and immediately recognized what he was. Special forces, probably with significant combat experience. The kind of man who would understand exactly what her statement implied. "Sometimes," she confirmed. Williams studied her for a long moment. "And where exactly did you acquire the medical training that allowed you to save that man's life?" 18 Delta training, Rebecca replied without hesitation. "Special Forces Medical Sergeant course, Fort Bragg." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Williams's eyes widened slightly, and Martinez took an involuntary step backward. 18 Delta was the military occupational specialty code for Special Forces medics. It was one of the most challenging and selective training programs in the entire military. The graduation rate was less than 40%, and those who completed it were considered among the most elite medical personnel in the world. But there was a problem with Rebecca's claim. Women weren't allowed in Special Forces. At least, they weren't supposed to be. "Ma'am," Williams said carefully, "I think there might be some confusion here. 18 Delta training is restricted to male Special Forces personnel. Women aren't eligible for that program." Rebecca smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a happy smile or a smug smile. It was the patient expression of someone who had heard that objection many times before and had long since stopped caring about it. "You're right," she said. "Women aren't eligible for that program. Officially." The word officially hung in the air like a challenge. Williams felt his pulse quicken as he considered the implications of what she was suggesting. "Are you telling me you completed 18 Delta training as part of some kind of classified program? I'm telling you that when people are bleeding out in places that don't exist on any map, nobody cares about gender restrictions. They care about who can keep them alive long enough to get home." Williams and Martinez exchanged a look that conveyed volumes. Both men had spent enough time in special operations to know that the official version of events rarely told the whole story. There were programs within programs, operations within operations, and people whose very existence was classified above their security clearance level. But this was still just talk, claims without evidence, and they were still dealing with an uninvited civilian trying to gain access to a restricted military ceremony. "Ma'am," Martinez said, "even if everything you're telling us is true, it doesn't change the fact that you're not on the authorized guest list. I understand you have a connection to Colonel Rodriguez, but I can't make exceptions to security protocols without proper authorization." Rebecca nodded as if she'd expected exactly that response. I understand your position, she said, but you should probably run my name through your database before you make any final decisions. Martinez frowned. We already checked the guest list. Not the guest list, Rebecca clarified. The personnel database. Military intelligence. Maybe start with a search for Phantom 77. Williams went very still. Phantom 77 was a call sign, and call signs in the special operations community weren't assigned randomly, they were earned, usually through actions that were too classified to appear in official records, but too significant to be forgotten by the people who mattered. Ma'am, Williams said quietly, who gave you that call sign? Rebecca's expression became distant, as if she were looking at something that happened long ago and far away. The same man you're burying today, she said. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, team leader, Ghost Unit 77, August 15th, 2018, Operation Black Diamond. The silence that followed her words was profound. Williams and Martinez both recognized the date and operation name, though they'd never heard the details. Operation Black Diamond was the kind of mission that was whispered about in secure conference rooms, but never discussed in public. The kind of operation that officially never happened. But they both knew that Marcus Rodriguez had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for actions on August 15th, 2018. The citation was classified, but the medal was real. And now, this woman was claiming to have been there. Martinez pulled out his encrypted communication device and began typing rapidly. If Rebecca Thompson was telling the truth, there would be records, buried deep in classified databases that required special authorization to access, but they would exist. While they waited for the database search to complete, the crowd of onlookers continued to grow. Word had spread that something significant was happening at the checkpoint, and more military personnel were arriving to see what the commotion was about. Among the new arrivals was Colonel Harrison, the Pentagon security chief who'd worked with Rodriguez on several classified projects. Harrison had the kind of security clearance that opened doors most people didn't even know existed, and his presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation. What's going on here? Harrison demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers. Martinez quickly briefed him on the situation, including Rebecca's claims about her military background and connection to Rodriguez. Harrison listened with the poker face of a man who had spent decades keeping secrets, but Rebecca could see the recognition in his eyes when Martinez mentioned Operation Black Diamond. Ms. Thompson, Harrison said, stepping closer to her, if you were really part of Ghost Unit 77, you'll be able to answer some very specific questions about that operation. Rebecca nodded calmly. Ask away. What was the primary extraction point for Operation Black Diamond? Landing Zone Serpent, grid coordinates 347986. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Rebecca saw his hands tighten slightly. That was classified information that couldn't be found in any public record. What was the duration of the firefight that necessitated emergency medical intervention? 14 hours and 27 minutes, Rebecca replied without hesitation. From 0347 hours to 1814 hours local time. How many casualties required medical evacuation? 24 personnel, 23 wounded, 1 KIA. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Those numbers were burned into his memory because he'd been the one who debriefed the survivors. But there had always been something missing from the official reports. Someone who had been there but wasn't officially there. Someone whose medical intervention had made the difference between a successful extraction and a catastrophic loss of life. The mystery medic who had never been identified because her very existence was classified above his security clearance level. Ma'am, Harrison said quietly, I need you to wait here while I make some phone calls. He walked several steps away and began speaking rapidly into an encrypted communication device. Rebecca couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the tension in his posture and the urgency of his gestures. Drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly? Share your story with our military family. The database search results appeared on Martinez's screen 15 minutes later. What he saw there made him understand why Harrison was making encrypted phone calls to people whose names he couldn't pronounce over an open channel. Rebecca Thompson's military record was almost entirely redacted. Black bars covered everything except her name, rank, and a series of commendations that read like something from a Hollywood movie. Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star. but it was the final entry that made Martinez's blood run cold. Status, Ghost. Access level, Cosmic. Contact, JSOC Direct. JSOC was Joint Special Operations Command, the most elite and secretive military organization in the United States. And Cosmic was a security clearance level that Martinez had heard of but never seen. The kind of clearance held by people who knew things that could reshape the geopolitical landscape if they ever became public. Major Williams read the screen over Martinez's shoulder and felt his worldview shift slightly. He'd spent 22 years in Special Forces and thought he understood how the military worked. But this woman represented something beyond his experience, something that existed in the shadowy space between official policy and operational necessity. "Ma'am," Martinez said, his voice hoarse with shock, "according to this database, you're listed as killed in action." Rebecca smiled sadly. "That's because Rebecca Thompson, civilian contractor, was killed in action on August 15th, 2018. What you see standing here is just a ghost who forgot to stay dead." The implications of her statement hit Williams like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors about such things. Operators who had been declared dead to protect their identities. People who had been so deeply embedded in classified operations that their official existence had been terminated to maintain security. But he'd always assumed they were just stories. Colonel Harrison returned from his phone calls with an expression that mixed respect, apology, and something that might have been fear. He approached Rebecca with the measured steps of someone navigating a minefield. "Ms. Thompson," he said formally, "I've just spoken with General Morrison at JSOC. He confirmed your identity and your service record. He also informed me that your presence at this funeral was specifically requested by Colonel Rodriguez before his death, though the request was classified above my clearance level until today." Harrison paused, visibly struggling with what he had to say next. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. And I've been instructed to provide you with whatever assistance you require to pay your respects to Colonel Rodriguez." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement, but didn't seem particularly interested in vindication. She appeared to be more focused on completing her original mission than on receiving apologies from people who had simply been doing their jobs. "I just want to say goodbye," she said simply. Harrison gestured toward the ceremonial area where the funeral preparations were reaching completion. "Ma'am, if you would allow me to escort you personally, it would be my honor." But before Rebecca could respond, the situation took another unexpected turn. Lieutenant Brooks, who'd been standing quietly at the edge of the group, suddenly stepped forward with the aggressive posture of someone who'd decided to challenge authority. "Wait just a minute," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I don't care what some database says or what phone calls were made. This whole story sounds like complete nonsense to me." Brooks was young, ambitious, and convinced that he was witnessing some kind of elaborate con game. He'd read about people who impersonated military personnel to gain access to events and benefits they hadn't earned. The fact that this woman's story was so exotic only made him more suspicious. "Sir," he said, addressing Colonel Harrison directly, "with all due respect, don't you think this is a little convenient? A woman shows up with no invitation and suddenly she's some kind of super secret special operations medic? How do we know this isn't just an elaborate scam?" Harrison's expression went very cold very quickly. "Lieutenant Brooks," he said in a voice that could have frozen fire, "you are speaking about a decorated veteran whose service record is classified above your security clearance level. I suggest you reconsider your position." But Brooks wasn't backing down. He'd committed himself to this course of action and felt he had to see it through. "Sir, I've seen her medical kit. I've heard her claims. But I haven't seen any proof beyond some database entries that could be faked by anyone with sufficient computer skills." Brooks turned to address Rebecca directly. "Ma'am, if you're really who you claim to be, prove it. Show us something that can't be faked or fabricated. Give us definitive proof that you were part of this mysterious Ghost Unit 77. Rebecca looked at Brooks for a long moment, and he found himself struggling to meet her gaze. There was something in her eyes that made him feel like a child challenging a parent. Something ancient and patient and utterly unimpressed by his bravado. "You want proof?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am," Brooks replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Rebecca reached for her canvas bag again, but this time her movements were different, more deliberate, more significant. She opened a side pocket that no one had noticed before and pulled out a small metal object. It was a challenge coin, but unlike any Brooks had ever seen. The metal was dark and worn, obviously hand-forged rather than mass-produced. One side bore the number 77 in simple numerals. The other side showed a skull with wings, surrounded by text that read, "Ghost Unit, no official existence." Brooks examined the coin with growing confusion. It was clearly authentic, showing the kind of wear that came from years of handling, but he'd never heard of any military unit that used challenge coins to acknowledge their non-existence. "This could be from anywhere," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone could have a custom coin made." Rebecca smiled again, and Brooks felt a chill run down his spine. "You're absolutely right," she said. "Anyone could have a coin made. But not everyone could have this coin made." She took the challenge coin back and held it up to the morning light. Brooks could see now that there were small marks etched into the metal that he had missed before. Tiny scratches that looked almost like tally marks. "These marks," Rebecca said, pointing to the scratches, "represent the number of lives saved during classified operations." Each mark was added personally by Colonel Rodriguez after mission debriefings. "This coin has 24 marks, Lieutenant. One for each person who came home alive from Operation Black Diamond because of medical intervention provided in the field." She paused, letting the significance of her words sink in. "If you want to verify this coin's authenticity, I suggest you ask Colonel Rodriguez's widow about the identical coin her husband carried. The one that was buried with him yesterday at the private family service. The one that has 24 marks just like this one, because we both earned them together." Brooks felt the foundation of his skepticism crumbling. The specificity of her claims, combined with the obvious authenticity of the physical evidence, was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence or fabrication. But he still wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Even if that coin is real," he said desperately, "it doesn't prove you were the medic who saved those people. You could have gotten it from someone else. You could have bought it, or stolen it, or found it somewhere." Rebecca's patience finally showed the first signs of wearing thin. She looked at Brooks with an expression that mixed pity and frustration, like a teacher dealing with a student who refused to accept obvious facts. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "how long have you been in the Army?" 2 years, ma'am," Brooks replied automatically. "And in those 2 years, have you ever been in combat?" Brooks's face reddened slightly. "No, ma'am. I've been stationed stateside for my entire military career." Rebecca nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Then let me explain something about combat medicine, Lieutenant. When people are bleeding out in hostile territory, with enemy forces closing in and extraction uncertain, medical personnel don't collect souvenirs. They save lives. And the only people who receive challenge coins from Ghost Unit 77 are the people who were there when it mattered most." She held up the coin again, but this time she pointed to something Brooks hadn't noticed before. A small inscription along the edge, so tiny it was almost invisible. "This reads, Phantom 77-Angel, she said. "Angel was my secondary call sign, used when I was providing medical support rather than tactical support. Colonel Rodriguez gave this to me on the helicopter ride out of the landing zone, after he had stabilized enough to understand what had happened during those 14 hours. Brooks squinted at the coin, trying to make out the inscription Rebecca was pointing to. The text was there, exactly as she'd described, etched in letters so small they could only be read under direct light. The level of detail in her story was becoming overwhelming. The consistency of her claims, the authenticity of her physical evidence, and the confirmation from multiple sources were creating a picture that was impossible to dismiss as fabrication. But Brooks was still struggling to accept what seemed impossible. "Ma'am," he said weakly, "even if everything you're telling us is true, why would you be working as a Pentagon janitor? Why would someone with your background and security clearance be cleaning offices?" Rebecca's expression softened slightly, as if she recognized that Brooks was finally asking the right questions, instead of simply challenging her credibility. "Because, Lieutenant, when you've been declared officially dead, your career options become somewhat limited. And because some of us believe that continuing to serve doesn't require wearing a uniform or carrying a rank. Sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, done by people who will never receive recognition for their sacrifice." She paused, studying Brooks's face to see if he was beginning to understand. "I clean offices in the Pentagon because those offices contain secrets that could get good people killed if they fell into the wrong hands. I make sure that classified documents are properly destroyed and that sensitive information doesn't walk out the door in someone's briefcase. I listen to conversations that people think are private and I report potential security breaches to people who have the authority to act on them. Brooks felt his worldview shifting as he processed the implications of what Rebecca was telling him. The idea that military intelligence operations could be conducted by people disguised as janitorial staff was both brilliant and terrifying. "You're a spy," he said, the word coming out like an accusation. "I'm a patriot," Rebecca corrected, "and I'm someone who keeps my word." When Colonel Rodriguez asked me to watch his back, I didn't stop watching just because the operation ended. I've been protecting his reputation and his legacy for 5 years, making sure that the classified work he did never became a liability to his family or his memory. She looked toward the ceremonial area where the funeral preparations were nearly complete. "Today is the end of that mission," she said quietly. "After today, I can finally let Rebecca Thompson rest in peace along with Marcus Rodriguez, and maybe I can figure out who I want to be next." Speaking of hidden assets, smart veterans are securing their financial future with high-yield military savings accounts, offering exclusive benefits and compound growth rates specifically designed for service members. The tension at the checkpoint was becoming palpable. Word had spread through the arriving guests that something significant was happening, and more high-ranking military personnel were gathering to observe the confrontation. Among the new arrivals was General Patricia Thompson, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, who had worked with Rodriguez on numerous classified projects. She approached the group with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command, her dress uniform pristine and her bearing unmistakably authoritative. "Colonel Harrison," she said, addressing the senior officer present, "I understand there is some kind of security issue developing here." "Ma'am," Harrison replied formally, "we've been conducting identity verification for an individual claiming to have served with Colonel Rodriguez in a classified capacity." General Thompson's eyes immediately focused on Rebecca, and her expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching shock. "My word," she said quietly, "you're the Phantom Medic." It wasn't a question. Rebecca met the general's gaze steadily. "Ma'am." General Thompson stepped closer, studying Rebecca's face with the intensity of someone confirming a long-held suspicion. "I've read the classified debriefs from Operation Black Diamond. Your medical interventions saved 24 lives and made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." She paused, her voice taking on a tone of deep respect. "The entire special operations community owes you a debt that can never be properly acknowledged or repaid." Rebecca's expression remained neutral, but those watching closely could see the slight tension around her eyes that suggested old pain being carefully managed. "I was doing my job, ma'am. Nothing more." General Thompson shook her head firmly. "No, Ms. Thompson. What you did went far beyond any reasonable definition of duty. You voluntarily exposed yourself to enemy fire for 14 continuous hours, providing medical support under conditions that would have broken most people. You saved lives at the cost of your own official existence." The general looked around at the assembled military personnel, her gaze settling on Lieutenant Brooks. "And now I understand that some question has been raised about your credentials or your right to be here today." Brooks felt the weight of the general's attention like a physical pressure. "Ma'am, I was simply trying to verify the authenticity of her claims." "Lieutenant Brooks," General Thompson said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could end careers, "Ms. Thompson's service record is classified at levels above your security clearance. Her presence at this funeral was specifically requested by Colonel Rodriguez and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Any further questioning of her credentials constitutes insubordination." Brooks felt his face burning with embarrassment and the dawning realization that he'd made a potentially career-ending mistake. "Ma'am, I apologize. I was just trying to ensure security protocols were followed." "Your dedication to security is noted, Lieutenant," the general replied coolly. "But in the future, I suggest you remember that not all heroes wear their achievements where everyone can see them. Some of our most valuable people are the ones who sacrifice their recognition to maintain operational security." She turned back to Rebecca with an expression that mixed respect, regret, and something that looked like personal gratitude. "Ms. Thompson, I want you to know that your service has not been forgotten, even if it cannot be officially acknowledged. The work you did in Afghanistan, and the work you've continued to do since then, represents the finest traditions of military service." General Thompson paused, seeming to struggle with something she wanted to say but couldn't quite voice in public. Colonel Rodriguez spoke of you often in classified briefings. He considered you one of the finest soldiers he ever served with, regardless of gender restrictions or official policies. He believed that your medical expertise and tactical judgment represented exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that made special operations successful. Rebecca's composure finally showed signs of cracking. For the first time since the confrontation began, her eyes glistened with moisture that she quickly controlled. He was a good man, ma'am. He deserved better than what happened to him. General Thompson nodded gravely. Yes, he did. And he deserves to have his friends present to say goodbye, regardless of what bureaucratic obstacles might stand in the way. She gestured toward the ceremonial area with formal precision. Ms. Thompson, would you allow me to personally escort you to the ceremony? It would be my honor to ensure that you receive the respect and recognition you've earned. But before Rebecca could respond, the situation took yet another unexpected turn. A black sedan pulled up to the checkpoint with the kind of speed that suggested urgent business. The driver's door opened immediately, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out with the fluid movements of someone accustomed to high-stress situations. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who held significant authority. His credentials, when he presented them to Colonel Harrison, identified him as Deputy Director James Morrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. Colonel Harrison, Morrison said without preamble, I need to speak with Rebecca Thompson immediately. This is a matter of national security. The assembled military personnel felt the atmosphere shift dramatically. The deputy director of the DIA didn't personally visit funeral sites unless something extraordinarily important was at stake. Morrison approached Rebecca with the measured steps of someone navigating a complex diplomatic situation. Ms. Thompson, he said formally, I apologize for interrupting what should be a private moment of grief, but I'm afraid circumstances have developed that require your immediate attention. Rebecca studied Morrison's face with the clinical assessment of someone trained to read deception and threat levels. She saw urgency, concern, and what looked like genuine respect, but no immediate danger. What kind of circumstances? She asked calmly. Morrison glanced around at the assembled crowd and clearly calculated the security implications of speaking in public. Ma'am, I need to brief you on a situation involving other members of your former unit, people who may be in immediate danger. The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Rebecca's entire posture changed from that of a grieving veteran to that of an active operator receiving mission parameters. Her eyes sharpened, her stance shifted to tactical readiness, and her voice took on the crisp efficiency of someone prepared for combat. How immediate? She asked. Morrison checked his watch with the precision of someone working on a countdown. We have reason to believe that hostile intelligence services have identified and targeted several former Ghost Unit members, people whose official non-existence was supposed to protect them. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. Ms. Thompson, we need your help to extract them before their covers are blown and they're eliminated. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Morrison was telling her. The idea that her former teammates were in danger activated every protective instinct she'd spent 5 years trying to suppress. How many? She asked. At least 4 that we know of, possibly more. Where? Scattered across 3 continents, all living under deep cover identities, all completely unaware that their existence has been compromised. Morrison pulled out an encrypted tablet and showed Rebecca a series of photographs. She recognized each face immediately, even though the images showed people who looked nothing like the warriors she remembered. Stevens was working as a high school teacher in Montana. Williams had become a fishing guide in Alaska. Martinez was running a small auto repair shop in New Mexico. Johnson was apparently working as a night security guard at a shopping mall in Ohio. All of them had successfully transitioned to civilian life after being officially declared dead. All of them believed they were safe from their past, and all of them were about to discover that the past never really stays buried. Rebecca studied the photographs with growing alarm. These people were her family, in the most fundamental sense of the word. They'd bled together, fought together, and kept each other alive through impossible circumstances. The idea that they were now in danger because of their past service was unacceptable. What's the timeline? She asked. Morrison's expression grew even more grave. We estimate 48 hours before the first hit team reaches their targets, maybe less. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling onto her shoulders. It was a burden she'd hoped never to carry again, but one she couldn't refuse when lives were at stake. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Morrison smiled for the first time since his arrival, recognizing the commitment in her voice. "We need you to help us find them before the enemy does. Your knowledge of their psychological profiles, their likely hiding patterns, and their survival instincts makes you the only person who can locate them quickly enough to save them." Rebecca nodded slowly, already beginning to calculate logistics and timeline requirements. But first, she looked toward the ceremonial area where Colonel Rodriguez's funeral was about to begin. "I need to say goodbye first," she said firmly. "After that, I'm yours." Morrison checked his watch again, clearly calculating whether they could afford the delay. After a moment, he nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Colonel Rodriguez deserves that much, but immediately afterward, we need to move fast." Rebecca looked around at the assembled military personnel, all of whom had been listening to the conversation, with growing amazement. What had started as a simple security check at a funeral had evolved into something that sounded like the beginning of an international espionage thriller. General Thompson stepped forward, her expression mixing concern and determination. "Thompson," she said formally, "I want you to know that you have the full support of the United States military for whatever operation you're about to undertake. These people were your teammates, and bringing them home safely is now our highest priority." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement, but her focus was already shifting to operational mode. The grief and nostalgia of attending Rodriguez's funeral would have to wait. Her surviving teammates needed her, and that took precedence over everything else. But first, she had a promise to keep. The funeral procession had begun moving toward the ceremonial site, and Rebecca found herself walking alongside General Thompson, Deputy Director Morrison, and Colonel Harrison. The crowd of onlookers had grown significantly, but now they maintained a respectful distance, understanding that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple security checkpoint incident. Lieutenant Brooks walked several steps behind the group, his face still flushed with embarrassment from his earlier confrontation with Rebecca. He'd spent the last 10 minutes trying to process the revelation that he'd been challenging someone whose security clearance was apparently higher than most generals. The reality that such people existed, hidden in plain sight throughout the military and intelligence communities, was forcing him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about how the system worked. As they approached the ceremonial area, Rebecca could see the honor guard preparing for the final tribute to Colonel Rodriguez. The precision of their movements, the crisp lines of their uniforms, and the solemn dignity of their bearing reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with military service in the first place. These were people who understood duty, sacrifice, and the weight of carrying something larger than themselves. But her moment of reflection was interrupted when Sergeant Davis approached the group with obvious urgency. "Ma'am," he said, addressing General Thompson, "we have a situation developing at the perimeter. Unknown individuals conducting surveillance of the ceremony from multiple positions." Morrison immediately pulled out his encrypted communication device and began coordinating with his security team. The revelation that hostile intelligence services had identified Rebecca's former teammates suddenly took on immediate relevance. If enemy operatives were already conducting surveillance of Rodriguez's funeral, it suggested that the threat was more imminent than anyone had realized. "Ms. Thompson," Morrison said grimly, "I think we need to accelerate our timeline. If they're watching this ceremony, they may already know you're here." Rebecca's tactical awareness kicked into high gear. She began scanning the surrounding area with the systematic precision of someone trained to identify threats in complex environments. Her eyes cataloged potential sniper positions, escape routes, and defensive cover with the unconscious efficiency of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. But before she could complete her assessment, the situation escalated dramatically. A figure emerged from the tree line beyond the ceremonial area, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged there. He was wearing the dress uniform of a military chaplain, complete with appropriate insignia and religious symbols. To most observers, he looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a clergy member arriving to participate in the funeral service. But Rebecca recognized something in his movement pattern that set off every alarm in her head. "That's not a chaplain," she said quietly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between legitimate personnel and hostile infiltrators. Morrison followed her gaze and immediately understood what she was seeing. The man's uniform was perfect. His credentials were probably flawless, but his tactical positioning and observation patterns marked him as a trained operative conducting reconnaissance. Security breach, Morrison spoke into his communication device. Unknown hostile approaching from the northwest. All units converge on the ceremonial area immediately. The honor guard immediately shifted into defensive positions without breaking their ceremonial formation. Guests began moving toward designated safe areas with the practiced efficiency of people who'd participated in similar security drills before. The entire atmosphere of dignified military ceremony transformed into controlled crisis management within seconds. But the hostile operative wasn't alone. Additional figures began appearing from concealed positions around the perimeter. They moved with coordinated precision, suggesting military training and careful planning. Their objective was clearly to neutralize Rebecca before she could provide assistance in locating her former teammates. "Ms. Thompson," General Thompson said firmly, "you need to get to safety immediately. We can handle this situation." But Rebecca was already moving, her body shifting into combat mode with the fluid efficiency of someone transitioning from civilian to warrior. The respectful mourner in the second-hand dress was gone, replaced by the tactical operator who'd earned her reputation in the most dangerous places on Earth. "Negative, ma'am," she replied, her voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command decisions under fire. "These people are here for me. Running would only endanger everyone else and give them time to establish better positions." She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out items that no one had noticed before: a compact communication device, a small tactical knife, and what appeared to be some kind of electronic jamming equipment. The transformation from grieving veteran to active operator was so complete that several people stepped back involuntarily. Morrison coordinated his security response while maintaining communication with his command center. "Ma'am, we have multiple hostiles converging on your position. Extraction helicopter is en route, but we need to hold this position for at least 8 minutes. 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours when facing trained killers in an open ceremonial area with limited cover and dozens of civilian guests at risk." But Rebecca had faced worse odds before. She began directing the defensive positioning of available security personnel with the calm efficiency of someone who'd commanded similar situations in hostile territory. Her instructions were precise, tactical, and delivered with the kind of authority that made people follow orders without question. Major Williams set up a defensive perimeter along the eastern tree line. "Sergeant Davis, coordinate guest evacuation to the building complex. Lieutenant Brooks, you're with me on overwatch and communication relay." Brooks felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror. An hour ago, he'd been challenging this woman's credentials. Now she was giving him tactical assignments in what appeared to be a real-world combat situation. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" he asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're going to demonstrate why Ghost Unit 77 had a 100% mission success rate," Rebecca replied grimly. "And we're going to make sure Colonel Rodriguez gets the funeral he deserved." The first hostile operative reached the ceremonial area and immediately took cover behind a marble monument. He was armed with what appeared to be a silenced rifle and began establishing a firing position that would allow him to eliminate Rebecca while minimizing risk to other personnel. But Rebecca had anticipated his approach. She moved with fluid precision, using the natural terrain and ceremonial structures to maintain cover while closing distance on the hostile position. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and demonstrated the kind of tactical expertise that couldn't be faked or learned from textbooks. Brooks watched in amazement as Rebecca transformed from a middle-aged woman in a dress into something that resembled a force of nature. Her positioning, timing, and tactical judgment were flawless, suggesting years of experience in exactly this kind of situation. "Lieutenant Brooks," she said calmly, "I need you to coordinate with Morrison's team and guide that helicopter to Landing Zone Bravo." Brooks realized he didn't know where Landing Zone Bravo was, but Rebecca's confidence was so complete that he found himself nodding agreement anyway. "Where is Landing Zone Bravo, ma'am?" "The location I'm about to secure," she replied, moving toward the hostile operative with predatory focus. What happened next would be talked about in classified briefings for years afterward. Rebecca approached the hostile position with the kind of tactical precision that made professional soldiers take notes. She used concealment, timing, and psychological pressure to force the enemy operative into a defensive position that neutralized his advantages. When the confrontation came, it was swift and decisive. Rebecca disarmed the hostile operative using techniques that demonstrated advanced close-quarters combat training. She secured his weapon, neutralized him as a threat, and established a defensive position that controlled the entire ceremonial area, all within approximately 90 seconds. The remaining hostile operatives, seeing their primary asset neutralized and their tactical advantage lost, began withdrawing from the area with the disciplined retreat of professionals who understood when a mission had become untenable. Morrison's security team arrived just as the threat was being neutralized, and he surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who just witnessed something extraordinary. "Ms. Thompson," he said with obvious respect, "that was impressive work, but I think we need to expedite your extraction immediately. This was clearly a coordinated attempt to eliminate you, which means they know more about your location and activities than we realized." Rebecca secured the captured weapon and checked the area for additional threats before responding. She was breathing normally, showing no signs of stress or fatigue from the confrontation. To observers, she looked like someone who just completed a routine training exercise rather than a life-or-death combat situation. "Agreed," she said, "but I'm not leaving until Colonel Rodriguez receives proper honors. These people died trying to prevent that, which makes it more important than ever." General Thompson approached with obvious admiration and concern. "Ms. Thompson, what you just accomplished was remarkable, but Deputy Director Morrison is right about the danger. Your presence here has clearly been compromised, and staying longer only increases the risk to everyone involved." Rebecca looked toward the ceremonial area where the honor guard was resuming their positions after the security incident. The funeral preparations were continuing with the kind of professional dedication that honored both the deceased and the living. "Ma'am," she said formally, with respect, "I made a promise to a friend. That promise doesn't become less important because keeping it has become dangerous." She paused, studying the general's expression to gauge her understanding. Colonel Rodriguez spent 14 hours under enemy fire keeping his team alive because that was his duty. The least I can do is spend 30 minutes honoring his memory, regardless of the personal cost. General Thompson recognized the resolution in Rebecca's voice and understood that further argument would be pointless. Some principles were more important than personal safety, and honoring the dead was one of them. "Very well," she said formally, "but we're maintaining full security coverage throughout the ceremony, and immediately afterward, you're accepting protective custody until this threat is resolved." Rebecca nodded agreement, though her expression suggested she had her own ideas about how the threat would ultimately be resolved. The funeral ceremony resumed with heightened security, but maintained dignity. Rebecca took her place among the mourners, finally able to pay her respects to the man who'd saved her life and given her a purpose worth dying for. But even as she participated in the solemn rituals of military honors, part of her mind was already calculating logistics for the mission she'd agreed to undertake. 4 former teammates scattered across 3 continents, all unaware that their carefully constructed new lives were about to be shattered by enemies they thought that they'd left behind years ago. The honor guard's rifle salute echoed across Arlington with crisp precision, and Rebecca felt the familiar weight of grief mixed with determination. Rodriguez was gone, but his legacy lived on in the people he'd trained, led, and inspired. Now it was her responsibility to make sure that legacy didn't die with him. Speaking of hidden assets, smart veterans are securing their financial future with high-yield military savings accounts, offering exclusive benefits and compound growth rates specifically designed for service members. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, Rebecca approached Rodriguez's widow with the careful respect of someone who understood the weight of loss. Mrs. Rodriguez was a small, dignified woman who carried her grief with the quiet strength of someone married to a warrior. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Rebecca said gently, "I wanted you to know that your husband saved my life. More than once. He was the finest leader I ever served with." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Rebecca with recognition that went beyond their brief introduction. "Marcus mentioned you," she said softly. "Not by name, because he couldn't, but he talked about the medic who kept everyone alive when no one else could have. He said you were the bravest person he'd ever known." Rebecca felt emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She reached into her bag and pulled out the challenge coin that had caused so much controversy earlier. "He gave this to me after Operation Black Diamond," she said, offering the coin to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I think it belongs with him now." But Mrs. Rodriguez gently pushed the coin back toward Rebecca. "Keep it," she said firmly. "Marcus would want you to carry it. He believed that the living should honor the dead through service, not sentiment." Rebecca accepted the coin with a formal nod, understanding the responsibility that came with it. "Mrs. Rodriguez studied Rebecca's face for a moment before speaking again. He also told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should trust you completely. He said you were the kind of person who would keep fighting for what's right, even when the cost became unbearable. The weight of that trust settled onto Rebecca's shoulders like a familiar burden. Rodriguez had known this moment might come, and he'd prepared for it in the only way he could. "Ma'am," Rebecca said formally, "I promise you that the people who took him from you will answer for what they've done. And I promise you that his memory will be protected, no matter what it costs." Mrs. Rodriguez squeezed Rebecca's hand with surprising strength. "I know it will," she said, "because you are still fighting his war. And Marcus never lost a war that mattered." Morrison approached as the conversation concluded, his expression mixing urgency with reluctant respect for the ceremony's importance. "Ms. Thompson," he said quietly, "we need to move. Intelligence indicates additional hostile teams are en route to this location." Rebecca took one final look at Rodriguez's grave, committing the image to memory. Then she turned to Morrison with the focused expression of someone transitioning from grief to operational mode. "Brief me on the extraction timeline," she said. "How long do we have before they reach the first target?" Morrison checked his encrypted device before responding. "Stevens in Montana has maybe 36 hours before the hit team reaches his location. Williams in Alaska might have 48 hours, but only because of the remote location. Martinez and Johnson have even less time." Rebecca calculated distances, travel times, and resource requirements with the rapid precision of someone trained in operational planning. 4 targets across 3,000 miles of territory, with multiple hostile teams converging simultaneously. It would require perfect coordination, flawless execution, and a significant amount of luck. "What assets do we have available?" she asked. Morrison smiled grimly. "Whatever you need, ma'am. This operation has been designated Priority Alpha by the Joint Chiefs. We have military transport, communication support, tactical teams, and emergency extraction capabilities at your disposal." Rebecca nodded, already beginning to formulate a strategy. But before she could respond, the situation took an unexpected turn. Lieutenant Brooks approached the group with obvious nervousness, carrying what appeared to be a classified communication device. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Rebecca directly, "I have an encrypted message for you from someone identifying himself as Eagle 7. Rebecca went very still. Eagle 7 had been Rodriguez's call sign during their final mission together. The only people who would know that designation were members of Ghost Unit 77, or intelligence personnel with access to their classified operational records. "Who transmitted this message?" she asked carefully. "Unknown, sir. It came through military communication channels with proper authentication codes, but the source is listed as classified above my clearance level." Rebecca accepted the device and read the message with growing alarm. The text was brief, but carried implications that changed everything about the current situation. "Phantom 77, the network is compromised. All assets are blown. They're not hunting us individually. They're coming for everyone at once. Activate Protocol 7 immediately. Eagle 7 is KIA, but his mission continues. Trust no one outside the family. Extraction coordinates follow." The message included grid references for locations in Montana, Alaska, New Mexico, and Ohio, along with precise timing requirements for a coordinated extraction operation. Rebecca felt her blood turn cold as she processed the implications. Rodriguez hadn't been killed in a random terrorist attack. He'd been assassinated to prevent him from coordinating the defense of his former teammates. The enemy had been planning this operation for months, possibly years, waiting for the right moment to eliminate everyone who'd participated in Ghost Unit 77's classified missions. Morrison read the expression on Rebecca's face and immediately understood that the situation had become significantly worse. "What does the message say?" he asked. Rebecca handed him the device with the grim expression of someone delivering very bad news. "It says we're not conducting a rescue operation," she said flatly. "We're conducting a counter-assassination mission against a coordinated attack that's already in progress." Morrison read the message and felt the foundation of his operational assumptions crumble. His team had been preparing for a defensive extraction operation, but this message suggested they were facing a full-scale offensive by a sophisticated enemy force. "Ms. Thompson," he said carefully, "if this message is authentic, we're looking at a completely different threat profile. Multiple teams, coordinated timing, comprehensive intelligence on our former assets. This is the kind of operation that requires significant resources and extensive planning. Rebecca was already moving toward the extraction helicopter that had arrived during the ceremony. Her transition from mourner to operational commander was complete, and everyone around her could feel the change in atmosphere. Deputy Director Morrison, she said formally, I need immediate communication with JSOC Command. We're not just saving 4 people anymore. We're preventing the systematic elimination of everyone who knows the truth about Ghost Unit 77's classified operations. She paused at the helicopter's door and looked back at the assembled military personnel who'd witnessed the day's events. And I need to know who else had access to those authentication codes, because someone on our side is feeding information to the enemy. The implications of her statement sent a chill through the group. The idea that the current crisis might involve domestic betrayal, as well as foreign intelligence operations, added layers of complexity that no one had anticipated. Brooks stepped forward with obvious determination. Ma'am, request permission to accompany the extraction team. Rebecca studied his face for a moment, evaluating his motivations and capabilities. Lieutenant, this isn't a training exercise. This is a real-world special operations mission with a high probability of casualties. Why would you want to be part of it? Brooks straightened to attention with military precision. Ma'am, I challenged your credentials earlier because I didn't understand who you were or what you represented. Now I do understand, and I want the opportunity to serve alongside someone who exemplifies the finest traditions of military service. He paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. And frankly, ma'am, I want to learn from the best. If I'm going to be a military officer, I want to understand what real leadership looks like under pressure. Rebecca considered his request for a moment before nodding approval. Very well, Lieutenant, but understand that you'll be following orders without question, regardless of how strange or dangerous those orders might seem. Ghost Unit operations require absolute trust and immediate execution. There's no room for hesitation or second guessing. Brooks nodded eagerly. Understood, ma'am. I won't let you down. General Thompson approached as the helicopter prepared for departure. Ms. Thompson, she said formally, you have the full support of the United States military for this operation. Whatever resources you need, whatever authority you require, consider it granted. She handed Rebecca an encrypted communication device. This will give you direct access to the Joint Chiefs of Staff if political authorization becomes necessary. Use it wisely. Rebecca accepted the device with appropriate gravity. Ma'am, I appreciate your confidence, but I need you to understand that this operation may require methods that exist outside normal military protocols. Ghost Unit 77 was created to handle situations that couldn't be resolved through conventional means. General Thompson met her gaze steadily. Thompson, I've read enough classified reports to understand exactly what that means. Do whatever is necessary to bring our people home safely. We'll handle the political consequences afterward. The helicopter lifted off from Arlington with Rebecca, Morrison, Brooks, and a small team of specialized operators whose credentials were classified above most security clearances. As they gained altitude, Rebecca could see the ceremony site growing smaller below them, but the weight of responsibility she carried only seemed to increase. Morrison coordinated with his command center, while Rebecca studied satellite imagery of their target locations. The geographic spread of the threats would require careful timing and flawless execution to prevent any of the hostile teams from completing their missions. Ma'am, Morrison said, we have confirmation that Stevens in Montana has gone dark. His communication devices are offline, and local authorities report suspicious activity in his area. Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. Stevens had been the team's electronics specialist, responsible for communication security and electronic warfare. If he'd been compromised, it meant the enemy had access to Ghost Unit 77's technical capabilities as well as their personnel. What about the others? She asked. Williams in Alaska is still responding to coded check-ins, but he's reporting unusual surveillance activity near his location. Martinez in New Mexico has moved to a safe house, but we're not sure how long his cover will hold. Johnson in Ohio has disappeared entirely. Rebecca processed this information with growing concern. The enemy's timeline was accelerating, which meant they either had better intelligence than expected, or they'd decided to abandon subtlety in favor of overwhelming force. Change of plans, she announced. We're not conducting individual extractions. We're going to use ourselves as bait to draw the hostile teams into a single engagement where we can eliminate the entire threat simultaneously. Morrison stared at her in shock. Ma'am, that would require exposing our position to multiple enemy teams with superior numbers and unknown capabilities. The risk assessment for such an operation would be completely unacceptable. Rebecca smiled with the grim confidence of someone who'd faced impossible odds before and survived. Deputy Director Morrison, she said calmly, the risk assessment for Ghost Unit 77 operations was always completely unacceptable. That's what made us effective. She pointed to a location on the satellite map that showed a remote airfield in western Colorado. We're going to establish a defensive position here and send a message through compromised channels announcing my location. When the hostile teams converge on our position, we'll have them concentrated in terrain of our choosing rather than scattered across the continent. Brooks listened to this plan with growing amazement and terror. The idea of deliberately attracting enemy forces to their location seemed like tactical suicide. But Rebecca's confidence was so complete that he found himself trusting her judgment despite his instincts. Ma'am, he said carefully, what makes you think we can successfully engage multiple enemy teams in open combat? Rebecca looked at him with the patient expression of a teacher explaining basic principles to a student. Lieutenant, Ghost Unit 77 wasn't successful because we were better shooters or stronger fighters than our enemies. We were successful because we understood that warfare is ultimately about psychology, not technology. When you control the psychological battlefield, you control the outcome of the engagement. She gestured toward the terrain map with tactical precision. By choosing our ground and timing, we force the enemy to adapt to our operational parameters instead of operating within theirs. By consolidating the threat into a single engagement, we eliminate their primary advantage of numerical superiority across multiple locations. Morrison coordinated the strategic changes with his command center, while privately questioning the sanity of anyone who would voluntarily attract multiple assassination teams to their position. But Rebecca's service record suggested that her tactical judgment was reliable, even when it appeared suicidal to outside observers. Ma'am, he said, I'm authorizing additional air support and rapid response teams for this operation. If we're going to gamble everything on a single engagement, we need overwhelming backup capabilities. Rebecca nodded approvingly. But remember, those backup capabilities can't intervene until we've identified and marked all hostile targets. If they respond too early, some of the enemy teams will escape to continue their mission against our former teammates. The helicopter began its approach to the remote airfield in Colorado, and Rebecca could see the defensive advantages of the location she'd chosen. High ground, limited approach routes, excellent fields of fire, and sufficient open space for air support operations. But, more importantly, it was the kind of location that would appeal to professional assassins as an ideal killing ground. Isolated, defensible, and far from civilian populations that might complicate their extraction plans. As they prepared to land, Rebecca gathered her small team for a final briefing. Gentlemen, she said formally, understand that we're about to engage in the kind of operation that will either end with complete success or complete failure. There are no partial victories in this kind of warfare. She looked at each team member individually, assessing their readiness for what was coming. Deputy Director Morrison, your role is to coordinate air support and maintain communication with command authority. Lieutenant Brooks, you'll serve as my tactical assistant and backup communication relay. The rest of the team will establish defensive positions according to the plan we discussed during flight. Morrison checked his equipment one final time. Ma'am, intelligence estimates suggest we're facing at least 12 hostile operatives across 4 teams. Even with air support, those are challenging odds. Rebecca checked her own gear with methodical precision. Her small canvas bag now revealed its true nature as a carefully designed tactical kit containing everything needed for extended combat operations. Deputy Director, she said calmly, Ghost Unit 77 once held off 200 enemy combatants for 14 hours with only 6 team members and limited ammunition. 12 operatives isn't a challenge, it's a warm-up exercise. Brooks felt his adrenaline surge as he processed the implications of what she was saying. The woman he'd challenged at the funeral checkpoint was apparently someone whose combat experience exceeded anything he'd imagined possible. Ma'am, he said, what are my specific orders for the engagement? Rebecca handed him a specialized communication device. Your job is to maintain constant contact with our scattered teammates and guide them to extraction points once the immediate threat is neutralized. Also, if something happens to me, you're responsible for ensuring that the truth about today's events reaches the appropriate authorities. Brooks accepted the device with hands that were steady despite his nervousness. Ma'am, nothing's going to happen to you. We won't let it. Rebecca smiled at his confidence, recognizing the fierce loyalty that made good soldiers great ones. Lieutenant, she said gently, I appreciate your determination, but understand that the most important thing is completing the mission successfully. Individual survival is secondary to ensuring that our teammates get home safely. The helicopter touched down at the remote airfield, and the team immediately began establishing defensive positions according to Rebecca's tactical plan. The location offered excellent visibility and multiple fallback positions, but it also left them exposed to attack from several directions simultaneously. Morrison coordinated with air support assets while Rebecca sent the coded message that would announce her location to the hostile teams hunting her former teammates. Within minutes, intercepted communications confirmed that multiple enemy units were converging on their position. Ma'am, Morrison reported, satellite imagery shows at least 3 vehicle convoys approaching from different directions. Estimated arrival time is 45 minutes. Rebecca checked her watch and calculated timing requirements for the engagement. 45 minutes would give them enough time to complete defensive preparations, but not enough time for the enemy to conduct detailed reconnaissance of their positions. Perfect, she said with satisfaction. They'll arrive with planned tactics based on limited intelligence, which means they'll be operating with false assumptions about our capabilities and positioning. Brooks took his assigned position and tested his communication equipment. Everything was functioning normally, but he found himself struggling with the surreal nature of the situation. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether his uniform met regulation standards. Now, he was preparing to participate in a special operations engagement against international assassination teams. Ma'am, he said over the tactical radio, all communication systems are operational. I have contact with Stevens, Williams, Martinez, and Johnson at their respective locations. Rebecca felt a surge of relief. If all 4 of her former teammates were still alive and capable of communication, the mission still had a chance of succeeding. Excellent, she replied. Inform them that hostile teams will be neutralized within the next 2 hours and that extraction assets are standing by for immediate deployment. She checked her defensive position one final time and settled in to wait for the enemy's arrival. The psychological component of warfare that she'd explained to Brooks was already functioning perfectly. By forcing the hostile teams to attack her position, she'd reversed the tactical dynamic from defense to offense. Instead of trying to protect scattered targets across impossible distances, she was now fighting a single engagement on ground of her choosing. But more importantly, she was fighting for something worth dying for, the safety of the people who'd become her family during the darkest period of her life. The first enemy team appeared on the horizon exactly 43 minutes after her message had been transmitted. They approached with professional caution, clearly aware that they were walking into a potential trap, but confident in their superior numbers and equipment. Rebecca watched them through her scope and felt the familiar calm that came with the transition from preparation to action. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd spent years perfecting, and what she'd never stopped being good at, despite her years of official non-existence. Deputy Director Morrison, she said quietly into her radio, initiate the engagement on my signal. Remember, we need to identify all hostile personnel before calling in air support. Morrison acknowledged her instructions and prepared to coordinate the complex operation that would determine whether Ghost Unit 77's surviving members lived to see another day. Just like Rebecca's concealed expertise, you can unlock hidden potential through specialized veteran education programs, offering accelerated degrees and professional certifications with full military benefits coverage. The engagement began at 14:27 hours with the precision of a choreographed performance. Rebecca had positioned her team to create overlapping fields of fire that would force the hostile teams into predetermined kill zones while maintaining concealment until the optimal moment for engagement. The first enemy team advanced with professional Gishin, using standard small unit tactics that would have been effective against conventional opponents. But Rebecca had anticipated their approach patterns and positioned her defensive elements accordingly. When the shooting started, it was swift and decisive. Rebecca's first shot eliminated the enemy team leader before he could coordinate his unit's response to the unexpected resistance. Her second and third shots disabled the team's communication equipment and heavy weapons capability. Within 30 seconds, the most dangerous enemy team had been reduced to ineffective stragglers seeking cover. Brooks watched the engagement with amazement and terror, understanding for the first time what surgical precision actually meant in combat. Rebecca's tactical decision-making was flawless, her marksmanship was extraordinary, and her ability to control the psychological aspects of the engagement was unlike anything he'd seen in training. "Ma'am," he reported over the radio, "second enemy team approaching from the northeast. Estimated strength, 6 personnel with heavy weapons support." Rebecca adjusted her position to engage the new threat while maintaining observation of the first team's survivors. The multidimensional nature of the engagement required constant calculation and split-second decision-making, but she managed it with the fluid efficiency of someone for whom combat had become second nature. The second enemy team was more cautious than the first, having heard the engagement and understanding that they were facing unexpected resistance. They attempted to establish a base of fire while maneuvering to flank Rebecca's position, demonstrating professional military training and combat experience. But Rebecca had faced better opponents in worse circumstances. She began a systematic process of eliminating their tactical advantages while denying them the initiative necessary for successful offensive operations. Her shots were precisely placed to destroy equipment, eliminate key personnel, and force the surviving enemies into defensive positions where they could be contained rather than eliminated. Morrison coordinated air support and backup ground teams while monitoring the engagement through satellite surveillance. What he observed confirmed everything he'd heard about Rebecca's legendary capabilities, but seeing them in action was still shocking. "Ms. Thompson," he said over the radio, "third enemy team is establishing overwatch positions on the ridge line. They're attempting to provide sniper support for the teams you are currently engaging." Rebecca acknowledged the information and adjusted her tactics accordingly. The arrival of the third team meant that the engagement was entering its most dangerous phase, when multiple enemy units could coordinate their attacks and potentially overwhelm her defensive positions through sheer volume of fire. But it also meant that most of the hostile personnel were now concentrated in a single location where they could be eliminated efficiently. "Lieutenant Brooks," she said calmly, "initiate extraction procedures for our scattered teammates. All hostile assets are now committed to this engagement, which means they are no longer available to threaten our people at remote locations." Brooks began coordinating with the extraction teams while maintaining his tactical communications role. The complexity of managing multiple operations simultaneously was challenging, but Rebecca's confidence gave him the determination to perform at levels he hadn't known he was capable of achieving. "Ma'am," he reported, "Stevens confirms that hostile surveillance has withdrawn from his area. Williams reports that suspicious activity near his location has ceased. Martinez and Johnson are both moving to designated extraction points without interference." Rebecca felt a surge of satisfaction as her tactical plan proved successful. By concentrating the enemy's attention on her position, she'd created the opportunity for her teammates to escape the traps that had been prepared for them. But the engagement was far from over. The third enemy team had established effective sniper positions and was beginning to place accurate fire on Rebecca's defensive positions. The increased pressure forced her to modify her tactics and rely more heavily on concealment and movement rather than static defensive firing positions. Morrison watched the tactical situation develop with growing concern. The enemy teams were demonstrating significant combat capability, and Rebecca's team was outnumbered by approximately 3-1. Even with air support standing by, the engagement could easily turn against them if the enemy succeeded in coordinating their attacks effectively. "Ms. Thompson," he said urgently, "recommend immediate air support engagement. The tactical situation is becoming untenable." But Rebecca understood something that Morrison couldn't see from his position. The enemy teams were now fully committed to eliminating her, which meant they'd abandoned the careful operational security that had made them so dangerous when they were scattered across multiple locations. "Negative, Deputy Director," she replied calmly. "Let them concentrate their forces and expose their positions. When they're all visible, we'll eliminate the entire threat simultaneously, instead of allowing some to escape and regroup." She adjusted her position and began the systematic process of identifying and marking all hostile personnel for the air support engagement that would end the battle. Her movement was fluid and purposeful, demonstrating the kind of tactical expertise that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training exercises. Brooks found himself studying her techniques with professional fascination, understanding that he was witnessing a masterclass in small unit tactics and psychological warfare. Every decision she made served multiple purposes, and every action contributed to an overall strategy that was becoming increasingly clear as the engagement developed. "Ma'am," he said, "all enemy teams are now visible and marked for air support engagement. Estimate 14 hostile personnel in fixed positions with limited mobility." Rebecca confirmed the target identification and coordinated with Morrison for the air support strike that would end the engagement decisively. "Deputy Director Morrison," she said formally, "you are cleared to engage all marked targets simultaneously. Ensure complete elimination of hostile capability and personnel." The air support engagement lasted exactly 97 seconds and eliminated the entire enemy force with surgical precision. When the smoke cleared, the remote airfield was secure, and the threat to Ghost Unit 77's surviving members had been permanently neutralized. Morrison surveyed the engagement site with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed something extraordinary. The tactical precision of Rebecca's plan, combined with her flawless execution under extreme pressure, represented exactly the kind of capability that made special operations effective. "Ms. Thompson," he said with obvious admiration, "that was remarkable work. Your tactical judgment and combat leadership were outstanding." But Rebecca was already focused on the next phase of her mission. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the larger questions about how the enemy had obtained their intelligence and who might have provided assistance from within the American intelligence community remained unanswered. "Deputy Director Morrison," she said, "I need immediate forensic analysis of all hostile personnel and equipment. We need to determine their nationality, organizational affiliation, and intelligence sources before we can consider this threat fully neutralized." Morrison coordinated with his technical teams while Rebecca conducted her own assessment of the captured equipment and documents. What she found confirmed her suspicions that this had been a sophisticated operation, backed by significant resources and extensive intelligence preparation. But it also revealed something more disturbing. "Lieutenant Brooks," she called, "I need you to examine this communication device. Tell me what you see." Brooks studied the equipment with growing alarm. "Ma'am, this appears to be American military communication technology. Specifically, it looks like equipment used by Special Operations Forces for classified communications." Rebecca nodded grimly, which means someone with access to our most sensitive communication systems provided the enemy with the technological capability to intercept and decode our operational traffic. The implications were staggering. Not only had someone betrayed the existence and location of Ghost Unit 77's surviving members, but they'd provided enemy forces with American military technology to make their assassination attempts more effective. "Ma'am," Brooks said carefully, "if this intelligence breach extends to our most classified communication systems, how do we know that our current communications are secure?" Rebecca considered the question for a moment before pulling out the encrypted device that General Thompson had given her at Arlington. "Because, Lieutenant, some communication systems are so classified that even the people who authorize them don't know they exist. This device connects directly to a network that was created specifically for Ghost Unit operations and was never integrated into standard military communication infrastructure." She activated the device and began coordinating with assets that existed outside normal military command structure. What she discovered confirmed that the threat was both larger and more complex than anyone had initially understood. "Deputy Director Morrison," she said formally, "I need you to understand that today's engagement was successful, but it was also a preliminary action in a much larger conflict. The enemy forces we just eliminated were expendable assets sent to test our capabilities and response patterns." Morrison felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. "Ma'am, are you saying that this was essentially a reconnaissance operation rather than a serious assassination attempt?" Rebecca pointed to the captured equipment and documents spread across the tactical table. The sophistication of this operation, combined with the intelligence resources required to plan it, suggests that we're facing an organized effort to eliminate everyone who participated in Ghost Unit 77's classified missions. She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. That includes approximately 47 people scattered across 6 countries, many of whom have been living under deep cover for years and believe they're completely safe from their operational past. Morrison realized that what he'd thought was a crisis involving 4 people was actually the beginning of a global counterintelligence operation that could affect dozens of American assets worldwide. Ms. Thompson, he said carefully, if that assessment is accurate, we need to immediately notify the highest levels of government and initiate protective measures for all potentially affected personnel. Rebecca was already coordinating those notifications through her classified communication channels, but she was also calculating the operational requirements for a defensive effort of that magnitude. Deputy Director Morrison, she said, I need you to arrange immediate transportation back to Washington. We're going to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the true scope of this threat, and we're going to recommend the reactivation of Ghost Unit 77 as an active special operations capability. Brooks felt his pulse quicken as he processed what she was suggesting. Ma'am, are you saying that Ghost Unit 77 is going to be reconstituted as an operational unit? Rebecca looked at him with the expression of someone who'd already made a decision that would change everything about her life. Lieutenant, she said quietly, Ghost Unit 77 never really disbanded. We just went underground to protect ourselves and our families from exactly this kind of threat. But now that the threat has found us anyway, there's no reason to remain hidden. She gathered her equipment and prepared for extraction, but her expression had changed from that of someone completing a mission to someone beginning a new campaign. Besides, she added with grim satisfaction, Colonel Rodriguez would never forgive me if I let his unit's legacy end with a bunch of foreign assassins in a Colorado airfield. Next week's story reveals another ghost operator hiding in plain sight. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The flight back to Washington gave Rebecca time to coordinate with her surviving teammates and assess their willingness to return to active operations. The conversations were difficult, emotional, and ultimately successful. Stevens, Williams, Martinez, and Johnson all agreed that their retirement had been permanently compromised and that their best chance of long-term survival lay in returning to what they did best. Morrison coordinated with the highest levels of government, while Rebecca prepared briefing materials that would reshape American special operations policy for years to come. The documents she compiled told the story of Ghost Unit 77's classified achievements, their forced retirement, and the ongoing threat to their survival. But more importantly, they outlined a strategic vision for how ghost operations could be used to address emerging threats that conventional military forces couldn't handle effectively. Lieutenant Brooks found himself assigned as Rebecca's aide-de-camp for the briefing process, giving him access to classified information that most generals never saw. The experience was transforming his understanding of how the military actually functioned versus how he'd imagined it worked. Ma'am, he said during the flight, I have to ask, why are you trusting me with this level of classified information? I'm just a junior officer with no special operations experience. Rebecca looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining fundamental principles. Lieutenant, trust isn't about rank or experience. It's about character and judgment under pressure. Today you demonstrated both of those qualities when it mattered most. She paused, studying his expression to gauge his understanding. Besides, Ghost Unit 77 has always recruited people based on potential rather than credentials. We're more interested in what you can become than what you are right now. Brooks felt his career path shifting as he processed the implications of what she was saying. Ma'am, are you offering me a position with Ghost Unit 77? Rebecca smiled for the first time since leaving Arlington. That depends, Lieutenant. Are you interested in the kind of military service that doesn't officially exist but makes everything else possible? Brooks didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Rebecca nodded approvingly and handed him a classified briefing document. Then your first assignment is to study these operational summaries and prepare tactical recommendations for our upcoming missions. We have 43 people to protect and an unknown number of enemy assets to eliminate. She looked out the helicopter window at the Washington skyline growing larger below them. Welcome to Ghost Unit 77, Lieutenant. I hope you're ready for the most challenging and rewarding military service you can imagine. The briefing at the Pentagon lasted 6 hours and resulted in decisions that would remain classified for decades. Ghost Unit 77 was officially reconstituted as an active special operations capability with enhanced funding, expanded authority, and direct accountability to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Rebecca was promoted to the rank of colonel and designated as the unit's commanding officer, with authority to recruit and train personnel according to her own standards rather than conventional military requirements. Lieutenant Brooks was transferred to Ghost Unit 77 with an accelerated promotion to captain and assignment as the unit's operations officer. But perhaps most importantly, the intelligence breach that had enabled the enemy's assassination attempts was traced to its source and eliminated with the kind of efficiency that sent clear messages to anyone else who might be considering similar betrayals. The formal ceremony, recognizing Rebecca's service and promoting her to her new rank, was held in the same Pentagon office where she'd spent 5 years working as a janitor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all Rebecca herself. General Thompson presented her with the insignia of her new rank and the classified commendation that officially acknowledged her role in preventing what could have been one of the most devastating intelligence disasters in American history. "Colonel Thompson," she said formally, "your service to this country has been extraordinary, and your commitment to protecting your fellow soldiers represents the finest traditions of military leadership." Rebecca accepted the recognition with appropriate dignity, but her focus was already shifting to the future rather than dwelling on past achievements. "Ma'am," she replied, "I appreciate the recognition, but the most important thing is ensuring that this kind of threat never develops again." Ghost Unit 77's new mission is to identify and eliminate threats to American Special Operations personnel before they become operational. General Thompson nodded approvingly. "Colonel, you have the full support of the United States military for that mission. Whatever resources you need, whatever authority you require, consider it granted." But Rebecca understood that formal authority was only part of what would be required for success. The real work would happen in the shadows, conducted by people whose existence remained officially classified and whose achievements would never be publicly acknowledged. That evening, Rebecca stood in her new office and looked out at the Pentagon parking lot where she'd caught the bus to her janitorial job every morning for 5 years. The view was the same, but everything else about her life had changed. Her encrypted communication device chimed with an incoming message, and she smiled as she recognized the sender identification. Eagle 77. The encrypted message was brief. Phantom 77, mission continues, new targets identified, extraction required for assets in Eastern Europe. Your move. Rebecca reached for her tactical gear bag. Some wars never really ended, and some warriors never really retired. They just changed uniforms and waited for the next battle. She activated her communication device and began coordinating with her team. Captain Brooks would handle logistics, Stevens technical support, Williams tactical overwatch, Martinez ground transportation, and Johnson extraction procedures. Ghost Unit 77 was back in business. Colonel Rebecca Thompson walked toward the waiting helicopter. Behind her, the Pentagon continued protecting American interests worldwide. But now she was protecting the protectors, ensuring those who sacrificed everything would never be abandoned. As the helicopter lifted off into the Washington night, her encrypted device chimed again. Phantom 77, additional assets require extraction, Moscow, Berlin, Tokyo, time sensitive, authorization level cosmic. Rebecca typed her response. Eagle 77, message received, Ghost Unit 77 is operational, extraction commences in 6 hours, Phantom 77 out. Some wars never end, they just change uniforms, and sometimes the battlefield is closer than you think. But when ghosts go to war, the enemy never sees them coming until it's already too late. Colonel Rebecca Thompson smiled as Washington's lights faded below. The funeral was over, but the mission was just beginning.
The stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel, and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.